Hey everyone, before we dive in, just a quick note. The views and opinions shared by our guests on Reset Critical are their own and don't necessarily reflect those of the institutions they represent, the host, producers, or any of our partners or sponsors. Some episodes touch on sensitive topics, so listener discretion is advised. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Reset Critical, where we go above the noise, beyond the anger, to have compassionate conversations about the issues that impact us most with human dignity and kindness. Today, I'm your host, Niaz Kasravi. Today, we're talking about an issue that is top of mind for a lot of people because we are seeing it so much in media and in social media. And it's really an issue that's hitting us really in the gut. We're going to talk about the issue of immigration in the U.S. Just a little context before we get started. As most of you know, Donald Trump, especially in his last election, ran on a platform of anti-immigration policies. And he promised to carry out the largest immigrant deportation in the U.S. In its history, targeting something around 15 million people. And at first, the discussion was around focusing on people who are here illegally and have committed violent crimes. True to his promise, he is carrying out what seems to be a very vast effort to deport as many immigrants and migrants as possible. However, a lot of that those talking points have changed in that there's no longer really just a focus on people with violent crime histories. In fact, the data shows that most people who are detained and have been picked up don't have a criminal record. And a lot of people who are actually going through proceedings to become legal, so they're following the law, they had court dates, are having their status taken away from them and brutally kidnapped, detained, denied their due process, I think, to the horror of folks like us who've been working on advocating for basic human rights and constitutional rights for everybody here in the U.S. One thing that we'll get into today is that we didn't just wake up in 2025 and this was the case. The U.S. has seen many iterations of anti-immigrant policies throughout its history. I do think that what we are witnessing today is on a scale and a level of brutality that many of us haven't seen. And it could partly be because we haven't been exposed to it. But I think the extent to which ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has become the largest law enforcement body in terms of budget and power in the world speaks volumes to what we're seeing and where we're going. So today, I'm really excited to be joined by Ashley Tabaddor. She is a senior legal consultant and expert on immigration law, federal litigation, and public policy. She spent 15 years as a U.S. immigration judge in Los Angeles. After that, she was appointed by the Biden and Harris administrations as chief counsel for U.S. Citizenship, Immigration Services, the Department of Homeland Security. Did I get that right?
You did.
Welcome,
I know it's a
Ashley.
mouthful. Thank you.
Well, it's a lot of accomplishments under your belt, so definitely wanted to give you props for that, and just really excited to explore this issue with you. First of all, how are you today? How do you come to us in this space?
Well, today is the unusual rainy day in Southern California. It's
know.
the first day that I think we're really feeling the change of season.
Yeah,
So
it wasn't just rain; it was torrential downpour last
it was
night.
a torrential downpour. That's right. That's right. It was both of our little dogs refused to go into the backyard this morning. So I knew things have changed. But thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. I think it's a very important conversation for us to have, both in trying to delve deeper and hopefully help more people better understand the framework that and sort of the time we live in now.
How do you see what's happening today with the raids, the kidnappings, the erosion of due process, the politicization of the courts? It's really hard to look at what we see every day and not be terrified.
Well, that's a good way of putting it. I think you're capturing a lot of it. From my perspective, I You mentioned a little bit about my background, but I've spent my entire professional career as a public servant and the vast part of it with the Department of Justice. And the last 4 years with the Department of Homeland Security, as you mentioned, working with the Biden-Harris team. From my vantage point, having lived from within the system, what I see this as, it's sort of emblematic of a much larger change, transformation that we're experiencing as a country. And the immigration issue is just at the forefront and a preview as to what we're going to experience next and have already started to experience. And what I mean by that is the immigrant community is the lowest hanging fruit. It's the easiest to be able to, within the legal frameworks, do with them what you wish. It's very easy to advance this very negative narrative, to dehumanize. The sort of the talking points that we've been hearing now over and over again is about invasion, is about criminals and rapists and murderers and terrorists, and there's just constant lambasting of the immigrant community to just label them with this one very, very demeaning and dehumanizing narrative, and then couple that with the legal framework that is very, very deferential to the executive branch in terms of how it treats the community. So I think you alluded to that this is not the first time we're seeing sort of anti-immigrant sentiments. Certainly, I'm now teaching a course on sort of intersection of constitutional law and immigration law, and it's prompted me to go back and look at some of those early cases that laid the foundation for the way that the government treats the non-citizen or quote-unquote the alien community. I think we can even pause on the use of the word alien.
100%.
I mean, a lot of times we know language matters, and I think even we know that anytime you make an us versus them, it makes it easier to treat the them as less than human. And I think just the very use of the term alien is in itself part of that strategy, that attempt to be able to dehumanize and to be able to treat as lesser. So yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start from the beginning or to even focus now, but there's so much to talk about, from what has happened with the use of detention, with the deprivation of due process, with deportation at all costs, and how the approach is much more systemic. It is not just one or two things. It really is a very, very deep understanding of how the system works as a whole and how to essentially disassemble every part to create a very smooth, frictionless deportation machine, and to also get a 2-for-1 deal. And what I mean by 2-for-1 deal is, okay, while you're doing all of this anti-immigrant sort of cleansing the society of all of this, it's giving concentration of power, police power, military power, to the executive branch. So what we're seeing is something that in the legal community is called the imperial presidency. It's this sort of philosophy of the president as being not just one that's overseeing the executive branch, but one who deems himself almost in that imperial light and asserts a lot of authorities that are masked in the language of executive power, but are really one of imperial or king-like powers. So that's why I said these are all previews of a much larger strategy that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear about the systemic and the contextualization of this, because I do feel like most of us who don't work on immigration issues and have not worked in the system don't know how we got here. So I definitely want to hear that. Before we get there, I wanted to ask, so there's a lot of misinformation out there, and you and I know some of it, and folks out there who are listening and watching us probably know some of it too, but others might be stuff that we just hear and we believe, right? So this notion of immigrants commit more crimes and people are sending their violent criminals from other countries to America, that under the Biden administration, the borders were just open. People were just flooding in. How do we make sense of all of this propaganda? What is propaganda? Like, what is your advice to people who just want to get this right, but are exposed to all of these talking points over and over and over again?
Yeah, I wish I could hand it to you in a quick soundbite. It just isn't. It isn't a quick soundbite. I think the reason that the way the right has been very effective is because they've turned the world into this binary world. This is us versus them. We're the good, they're the bad, they're the undocumented, and they've basically made the undocumented criminal, treating them as criminal, tagging them as criminal, and then putting the stamp of rule of law on top of it and say, hey, we're just trying to, enforce the law to the fullest extent, and look at all these people who are violating the law, they're undocumented and or sort of criminals. So we're just doing what any executive power should be doing. And it isn't like that. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that Congress and the legal framework that we live in actually contemplates providing protection and access to due process and treating people with dignity. And so this tag of undocumented, which is now being used for everybody and anybody, is probably the first and foremost source of misinformation. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is you can't put everybody in one bucket. So yes, people may come to the border and seek protection. They may not have papers, quote unquote. But under our laws, they have the right to seek protection. They have a right to process. And I think that's the part a lot of people it doesn't resonate, or they don't understand. And they think, oh, okay, well, what gives them the right to show up? What gives them the right to seek access to process? Or conversely, if somebody is here and came in maybe on a visa and is now trying to avail themselves of another process that's available under the law and is waiting in a backlog of maybe hundreds of thousands or millions of cases, or a backlog of a court or backlog of USCIS, that's again something that our legal framework allows for.
Backlog of, I'm so sorry.
U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That's the agency within the Department of Homeland Security that's tasked with processing all these applications of anyone who wants to avail themselves of some sort of immigration benefit. So the person who's trying to get employment authorization, the person who's trying to get a change in their student visa status, or wants to go from a non-immigrant to an immigrant visa, asylum applicants, naturalization applicants, your H-1B visa, those are all the people that can go to USCIS to have those applications adjudicated. I think the year we left, we completed over 13 million applications.
Wow.
I throw that out there because I think people don't fully appreciate that this is normal. We've always had this type of numbers. This is not, yes, it was the highest number we had processed, but processing millions and millions of applications a year is actually par for the course.
Did it mean that the borders were open and more people were walking in, and therefore you had to process more applications? I think this is the image that people have, is like swarms of people flooding in over the border. And I just don't know that that's real.
And that's even a controversial sort of steps that the previous administration, the Biden administration, took in trying to address the numbers of people coming to the border. And there was a recognition that, first of all, there was COVID. So there was a suspension of all the laws, all the asylum laws for years because of COVID. So there was this ramped up sort of demand that people had been sort of waiting, because a lot of people that were attempting to come in or attempting to seek protection because of COVID and sort of the reliance on Title 42, so to speak, they were not given even access to the system. So people were being processed. And a lot of times the numbers that are being cited as, oh, they had this many encounters, it was literally the same person coming and keep trying to seek protection, to come and apply. And because the immigration system was essentially suspended during that time, and that was both in the first Trump administration and half of the Biden administration, So those numbers that people keep pointing to, they're not unique individual encounters. We've had people sometimes 30, 40 times that they would be trying to sort of seek and come and they would just turn around and they would become another statistic. The other part was this recognition that, okay, yes, maybe the numbers of people that are coming at the southern border is increasing, one, because COVID is in our rear view mirror to a certain degree, and people are, the cooped up demand is now being released. But just a recognition that there is a higher global migration that's happening. And I think that's, again, I know you and I, every time we talk, I keep trying to put things in context. And I appreciate that people just want to say, but there's people here. I said, I understand, but you can't have a conversation about people at the southern border if you can't look at the context. Literally within days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, we started seeing people at the southern border. So it is, the southern border was almost the pulse of what's happening on the globe and people's attempts to try to secure protection within the legal framework that our legislators have provided.
I think it's very important points that most people don't even think about. I don't think most people reading or listening to the news and hearing these numbers think about, oh, COVID, what happened during COVID to people who were trying to come, right? I want to highlight something else that you said. You said that people have a right to come to this country and apply for legal status. And so then, does that mean that being undocumented is not a crime?
That's right. I think that's one of the things that people don't fully appreciate. Coming to the country, coming to the border, and actually turning yourself in and saying, I would like to seek protection, is not a crime. And in light of World War II, in light of the Holocaust, in light of all of our involvement into international treaties and the recognition that we want to be part of an international community and provide protections to people who are refugees, that's what our legal framework is based on. This understanding that if you come and seek protection, and it's a very limited protection. It's, I think a lot of people don't understand, but it's asylum if you're in the United States, or refugee if you're trying to come from outside the United States. Either way, the underlying definition is the same. You have to show that you have a likelihood of persecution, which is a severe form of harm in your home country based on 5 protected grounds. So political opinion, race, nationality, religion, or this catch-all sort of particular social group. And you have to show that the government is either the one that's going to inflict this harm on you, or that the government is sort of unable or unwilling to protect you against that. This is the legal framework that has been on the books for decades, since World War II. And this is part of the humanitarian mission of our country, the values that we have espoused, frankly, until just a few months ago. And this is part of what we owe as a member of the international community. But we also at the same time recognize that, okay, there's capacity issues too. So there is a practical reality. And so that was what we were dealing with in the previous administration, is how do you create a sort of a regularized process, and therefore take a look at where are the sources of a lot of this migration, what's happening in Venezuela. I mean, with the dictatorial changes and the systemic oppression of people and political dissidents that caused literally millions of people to leave. A lot of people don't even realize that Colombia took literally 3 million people. By comparison to the population of Colombia, we were taking drops in the bucket, right? So I know I keep bringing it back to context. I know we can talk about specifics, but I think it's important to keep pulling the lens back and saying, well, where does this fit in the big picture? What are the interests and commitments that we have? What's the legal framework that has been on the books for decades and informs our approach to this? Because all of that has, frankly, just been thrown out.
Yeah. So maybe spend a little time talking to the lay population, your average person who might not be an immigration expert, about that context, just a general overview of the history of immigration, recent history of immigration in the US and how it is that we got here.
Sure. I mean, in a nutshell, the recent framing of immigration is based on two or three overriding principles. One is family unity. So you can, immediate family members or parents, spouses, children, siblings, those that kind of very core immediate family. The family reunion or unification is one of the founding principles of immigration law. So there are legal pathways available for people who are citizens or lawful permanent residents, green card holders, to petition for those family members to come. So that's one. The second one is for work. So recognizing the interest of the American work force in areas in which the American workforce can't meet the demands, the goal is to bring in workers. So that's the second part. So you have a lot of employment-based, whether it's non-immigrant or ultimately immigrant-based, employment-based pathways to come in. And then the third part is the humanitarian mission. It's the asylum, it's the refugee processing. We have overseas refugee processing. Every year there's a certain number that in consultation with State Department and all of that, there's a number that the executive branch chooses in terms of trying to help bring refugees. But alongside of that is sort of the humanitarian mission of asylum, protecting those who need protection from persecution. So that's very broad brushstroke. It's these, what I would call these three buckets: family unity, employment need of the American workforce companies, and the humanitarian commitment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think many people, unfortunately, not everybody, and I hope I'm wrong actually when I say this, but what I see, especially in this online world of ours where we just get looped into these algorithms, is, a lot of people have just stopped caring. Okay, family reunification, whatever, humanitarian aspect, whatever. So there's people that don't actually care about that. They care mostly about the economic aspect of so part of our system actually allows for us to bring folks to the country to support our economy. And correct me if I'm wrong, that has been turned into these people are coming and taking American jobs. And this is why, unemployment rates and whatnot. But will this recent iteration have an impact on our economy in the long run?
I think
or even in the short run, I'm sorry.
I was reading just a few days ago that the agricultural industry is really, really hit. One of the hardest industries hit with all of these raids, because over 40% of the population has been, 40% of the workforce has essentially been the undocumented that have both relied on that work and the agricultural industry that has relied on those workers. And I think this is the part that to me has been very interesting, that we keep talking about, oh, they're coming to take work away. But no, they're coming to fill the positions that the average American doesn't fill, doesn't want to do it. And we're seeing that because now they are absolutely taking them away. And there's all these conversations about, well, how do we subsidize the agricultural businesses? So, well, why don't you allow for more lawful pathways for people, the immigrant community who's willing to come and do this work, and give them dignity rather than forcing them to have to do it in an undocumented fashion, or to target them, to terrorize them, and deport them and separate them from their family. I mean, that's just one industry. I remember reading about it in the meatpacking industry. Most of those factories, it's gruesome work that there has to be done. And most of the times they can't get it. They can't get the average American to come and work in those industries. And we also know about the service industries, or sort of from, be it hotel or some of the, or the more traditional sort of at-home care, things of that sort. So, I mean, that's just, and I'm just frankly, in many ways, just stereotyping from the easiest
Yeah,
sort of
no, I
categories
understand.
that we're all familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, we're here in the fashion district in downtown Los Angeles, and it's heartbreaking. This used to be just
So vibrant.
hustling and bustling with vendors and shoppers and shops open. And now every time I come here, my heart breaks, you know?
I mean, I feel like when did we go from focusing on the worst of the worst, sort of the murderers, the rapists, the violent criminals, and then to this, where we are now trying to penalize the very people who are the example of industrious work. Every one of us are either immigrants ourselves or stand on the shoulder of immigrants, if not forced, slavery. So very few of us are actually from the United States. So the audacity to come and sit here and now, stand on this side of the line and point to the other and dehumanize and terrorize and just the type of behavior that we are seeing being not just tolerated, but being supported and being deliberately inflicted.
I tried to not be very super negative in terms of people have just turned callous to thinking there's a trauma or a fear that is blinding people to their own humanity and to the connection they have with other human beings. Like you said, you and I are both Iranian, Iranian Americans. And there was no way we would have been able to come to this country and have the opportunities that we did if it wasn't for people who paved the way. And now somehow you even see people from immigrant communities who actually benefited from the history of immigration to America being really just heartless about this issue and careless about the fact that people are being brutalized, even though maybe they don't, they come from different communities, but that sense of connection is lost, and I don't know how this is why I'm doing this. I need to help to switch it back. I cannot be the kind of person to think that, oh, humanity is doomed and we're all bad inside. And, no, I believe that we have choices and we need to choose to be good, And so it doesn't always work out because people make all kinds of crazy choices. But I think that there's some sort of human connection that's been lost, even just internally. I say this story often. I was at a family gathering and somebody who is of a different political belief than I am, they support the Trump administration, were sitting next to me and they were saying, did you see that video of that immigrant man committing that crime and beating up that woman on the New York subway? And I was like, what does it matter who committed the crime? Are you more concerned about who committed the crime versus the fact that this egregious act was committed, and how do we stop that? And I think somehow we've skimmed over that.
I was having this conversation the other day with the students about this, to kind of say it's so interesting when you're in the world of us versus them. It takes one act by one person to define the entire community. But when you're one of them, somehow you have the ability to be able to decipher the fact that it's not that community characteristics that made that person act in an undesirable way. And you're much more open to looking at the sources of that. I used the example, I said, in the context of national security conversations, and you and I know about this, post 9/11, Muslim men, certain community. I mean, it was just, and it has now just even expanded. And one of the things that we kept trying to tell people is, look, you may initially think I'm not one of them. It's going to come for you. It may not happen today, but it's already coming from you. This narrative of terrorism, this ability to be able to use that precedent of demonizing an entire group based on the acts of a few that doesn't in any way represent the many has been used, and people, because they see them as the other, somehow more readily accept that classification. Because it's weird, because it just sort of resonates with them. Well, that seems common sense. The first thing I see is that they are from that, those people were from that country, or they looked that way, or their religion was that way. And so it's easy to say, well, then it makes sense to be more worried about people. We're not saying everybody's like that, but we need to be more worried about them. But, for example, in the context of gun violence, every day, every year, we're seeing literally thousands of people who are just being massacred. But somehow we have the ability to pause and look and say, well, we can distinguish between this. It really is not that. There's this source for it. And then on top of that, we value so much the Second Amendment that we're willing to sacrifice for it. But in the context of the immigrant community, they have been so successful at vilifying the immigrant community that there isn't any counterbalance to say, well, we value. I mean, we used to be proud of being a nation of immigrants, and so at least we would pause a moment before we would vilify. But now everybody's been broad brushstroke painted with the same paint, and that kind of safeguard, guardrail, whatever you say, going back to that humanity, somehow we are tolerating the type of activities that we would never ever tolerate before. Or at least I shouldn't say we should never ever. We've tolerated a lot of brutalities, but what in my time on this earth, in this country, which has been decades, I haven't seen this type of brutality on this scale.
Yeah. I don't know if polarization is the right word, because it's beyond that. It's almost people reveling in watching that brutality. And I don't know how that happened. And I don't know, this is something you mentioned earlier, that if you're the group in power, even if people from your group do something, it doesn't define who you are. But if you are a minority or marginalized community member, an anecdotal case, like, just paints the entire, so I don't know what happens in our brains where, well, I have a theory. It's not really what happens in our brains. But for example, the whole issue of political violence and who has been responsible for the vast majority of incidents of political violence in the U.S. And that's, extreme white power nationalists, neo-Nazis, right? But somehow nobody paints the white community, and it's not right to do that, right? But, what happens in our brains where we ignore those facts and those numbers, or maybe we just, anything that does not sit well, we say is false or is not true or it's a lie or it's fake news. But it also doesn't help when your own government pulls those numbers and those studies.
I was going to say, DOJ immediately pulled down actually the reports that talked about the vast majority of domestic political violence is attributed to the right. And as you mentioned, and then immediately, and then pulled it down right before demonizing the left, categorizing it as terrorists, categorizing it as left, as the radical left, and it's troubling. That's why I said what's happening to the immigrant community is the tip of the iceberg, is the previews to what's coming and what we're seeing on so many other levels for us as a whole. And if you think being a citizen is going to protect you, I'm here to say you got some wake-up calls that are going to be waiting for you. We're already hearing narratives about distinguishing between the natural citizens versus sort of birthright citizen. We're already looking at the way they're attacking birthright citizen, the way they're trying to take away naturalized citizens' rights. But we've also heard the president talk about, well, I'm looking for places that I can send our own citizens, our bad people, to send them out of the country.
Talk about exporting your criminals.
I mean, so I'm just saying, that's what I keep saying. If you think you're going to be spared because you're not a quote unquote undocumented alien, you've got another thing coming.
A rude awakening.
Yep.
I think something that has been really making me nervous, really in the back of my head, since the DOJ took down those numbers, is what are we going to do to preserve our data? Because if we can't have access, and they're going to stop collecting it potentially at some point, how are we going to talk about these issues? How are we going to know what's actually fact and what's fiction? And I think that's the goal, and it's terrifying. And so I keep thinking about, who needs to be working together to preserve what data is out there on police brutality, on political violence, on racial profiling, on, all of it, everything that has been deemed, I joke with my friends sometimes that it's now almost criminal to do what I do, which is racial justice advocacy.
It is. Oh, they have flipped the script. It's on its head. Absolutely.
Yeah.
They were going to, absolutely, you will be targeted.
Yeah. It's quite scary. But when we first started, you were talking about sort of a little bit further back, not just the recent history of how we got here and the different waves of, immigration and the backlash to that in the U.S. And I wonder if you can just briefly kind of let us in on that history a little bit. Yeah, so people know that, like, this is not, we didn't wake up to this, and this is not new, and it might be a little different in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's both the good news, the bad news, is that in many ways the sort of anti-immigrant sentimentality is not new, but certainly in recent history, this is the worst. And because of technologies and the amount of resources that has now been devoted to it, it's the scope that we're seeing is pretty unsurpassed. But I think a lot of times what I try to do is tell people that if you go back to the birth of our country and then look at the way that we treated immigration, there was really no borders then. It's like you just showed up. And the only thing in the Constitution that ever talks about it is that Congress shall make laws regarding naturalization, which is sort of citizenship. And for centuries, the rule on naturalization was that you had to be a free white person. So there was a lot of effort, and a good colleague of mine, Professor Tehranian, has a fabulous book on this that goes into the history of the naturalization and the whiteness, and talks about sort of the invisible Middle Eastern sort of community in the U.S., the Indian population, the Iranian population, trying for decades to say they're white for the purposes of getting citizenship. But I think when you go back and you realize the country initially wasn't really focused on this immigration sort of framework the way we see it now. People came in and literally the next day they were working. People came in and started living here. Path to citizenship wasn't available to most, but they were come here, and then depending on, a lot of times the states were the ones who were trying to navigate, well, who do we want to bring in? Who do we think is going to be potentially, quote unquote, undesirable from those who can become on welfare or can become criminals, things. So these conversations about welfare or taking our jobs or criminal is not new. And the scapegoating is not new. The very first sort of set of Supreme Court decisions that laid the groundwork are known infamously as the Chinese Exclusion Act cases. So for decades, we brought in scores and scores of Chinese immigrants to build the railroads, to build the bridges, to all of these infrastructure. And there's a lot of, a lot of people may not realize how many thousands of Chinese immigrants have lost their lives in building those railroads and building those bridges. But then at some point, there was this change of tides and said, well, oh, now we're being invaded. Literally the same language.
When the work was done.
When the work was done. We're being invaded. Their culture is not the same. They don't speak our language. They're criminals. They're not trustworthy. Now, extreme pressure to push them out. And then at a time frame where you would look to see how we started treating them, again, that us versus them. You know, the Chinese Exclusion Act cases stem from Chinese immigrants who had been living in the United States for years, having roots and ties and everything, and still being pushed out. Basically pushed out, one of them, one category, pushed out because they couldn't get a white person to vouch for the fact that they've been living here. Other pushed out because he happened to leave and try to come back. And the Supreme Court said, hey, we're going to reframe like this entire conversation, not as one within the constitutional right of the individuals who lived in our country or live in our country and are protected by the language of the Constitution. A lot of people don't realize most of the Constitution doesn't distinguish between citizens and non-citizens. You look at the First Amendment, there's no distinguishing. It's all about persons. It's all about people. And it applies to them. So the language of the Constitution applies to non-citizens. But the way that the Supreme Court has dealt with it, they have reframed it as sovereign, sort of this sovereign power of a country to be able to control its borders and to be able to decide who comes and who goes, to reframe it as the context of foreign policy that should be all within the powers of the executive branch or the political branches like the Congress and the presidency. So it sounds, oh, well, okay, yes, this should be, why not? These are the political branches. They're supposed to be responsive. But what it does is it sacrifices the individual rights that Congress and that the Constitution provides by making it secondary in this other framework. So constantly turning a blind eye to what is flagrantly unconstitutional if it was applied to a citizen, even though the Constitution doesn't make that distinction, but reframing it as national security, foreign policy, plenary power of the executive branch. We're seeing it over and over again.
When I was in grad school, young, bright-eyed, idealistic, and I, like many people, I revered the Supreme Court. I said, all these things that are, problematic that are happening, it's going to make its way up, and the Supreme Court is going to, and now it's quite scary, what happened to our checks and balances, and also, is there any going back, or I guess not back, but forward in a positive way? Because I don't particularly always like the concept of going back. I feel like you have to move forward, but you have to move forward in a positive direction. But I feel like we've gone towards a very negative direction. And now when you have the, what I thought was the law of the land and the people who were going to eventually save us acting the way that they're acting.
It's tough to grapple with that because, again, I keep going back to this class I'm teaching, which is talking about the Constitution and its sort of intersection with immigration law. So I've had to go back and sort of reread a lot of things. And what I point to, and I suggest people read it again, is the Federalist Paper of 51. And it's sort of the underlying philosophy behind the entire system of checks and balances, the entire system of separation of powers, the entire system of federalism. And some of these concepts may be new to your audience, but these are really critical concepts that I think everyone needs to refamiliarize or familiarize themselves with. And I think for the longest time, you mentioned the Supreme Court may have played a balancing act from the perspective, from our perspective, that look, they're a check, and now they're not. Now they're sort of part of that support of centralization of power in the executive and sort of this abdication of a lot of their role in the way that we grew up understanding the role of the Supreme Court. But what I like to, I guess, put my hope in is that fundamentally the blueprint for the Constitution was a certain basic understanding of human nature, which is that you want to pit ambition against ambition, and you want to do it in as many parts as possible to make it as difficult as possible for people, for that concentration of power, which inevitably leads to tyranny. And I think in our lifetime, what we're seeing now is that concentration of power in a way that we hadn't in our lived experience, or at least my lived experience, we hadn't seen it. You know, we now have this sort of trifecta that's happening, along with an executive that is just sort of unhinged. And so now we're kind of having to lean on the sort of the state power and on civil society, on individuals standing up, kind of going back to the roots. And that's, that's not a switch. That's not a switch that just sort of turns on and goes into full blast. It's one that's going to take a little revving up or warming up.
So you think it's possible to recover? It's going to take time, and we put our hope at this moment in time in civil society, in humanity, in individuals learning and educating themselves and coming together. Is that the path that you see to recover from this kind of darkness?
I think I see it as a two-step process. I still see litigation, sort of the courts, as an important part of the strategy. I mean, most of the courts, particularly the district courts, have been sort of applying the traditional framework and the rule of law that we all are familiar with, and for the most part trying to do the right thing. The problem is obviously that the Supreme Court, for particularly a lot of these high priority policies of the administration, have been very, very much sort of bending over backwards to support. And they're changing the narrative, they're changing the messaging that's going to the district courts. But by the same token, I still think the litigation right now is still very important, but the litigation isn't going to save us. Mm-hmm. The litigation is basically the front line troops trying to hold the line as much as possible in order for the civil society to frankly wake up, mm-hmm. for them to sort of realize, wait, what? This is happening in my time, under my name, and to be able to sort of hold their representatives accountable, hold each other accountable, right? To care about what's happening, to do something. And I feel that until and unless people actually better understand and better sort of tune in, the litigation isn't going to save us, because they're going to do what they want to do. They will present the narrative that they want to present with or without factual basis. I mean, I think what we're seeing, even, they've attacked the judges that have ruled against them, including even Trump's own judges, or Reagan appointees or Bush appointees, some of whom have been the most critical and the loudest voices against what they're doing. I think one of the recent ones talked about how much the government's position has been untethered to facts.
Yeah, it's true. And I think what is interesting and important for us to realize is that people, civil society, communities have to do this level of engagement and learning and fighting back at a time where they're being brutalized and oppressed. Our education system is being decimated. Facts are being removed. So I think we have to really get creative. And
it feels overwhelming, doesn't it?
Yeah, but sometimes I think we have to do things the old-fashioned way now. If it's not safe to strategize, on a Zoom call that can be, just get in a room, talk to people. If you can't look at things up online, because go to the library. Do you know, and there's people who have done this in the past, advocates, previous generations of advocates who can probably teach us a lot about what this moment might require when some of the luxuries and the tools that we're using to educate ourselves were not available, you know. Um, I have one question that's I meant to ask it. It's just out of curiosity. My question is about, this backlash and this targeting of undocumented immigrants or migrants who are working without, documentation. Has there ever been historically or now any sort of penalty or penalization for the people who are employing these, or is that against capitalism?
You may not remember this, but the quote unquote, the amnesty laws that were passed, they were passed in the early 80s during Reagan. And the idea was that, okay, we're going to give amnesty for the people who are here in the United States, recognizing that the reason they're here is because there is work for them. So there is this demand for this workforce. And then they said, all right, we're going to provide amnesty for these people, give them the work, the work permits, and we're going to put in a system that penalizes employers who then hire and particularly exploit undocumented non-citizens. So what ended up happening, interestingly enough, was that, okay, the amnesty happened, but then the pressure from the business community was very strong, and they created a lot of sort of barriers to, in terms of accountability for the employers, and to be honest with you, from my perspective, I always felt that, well, I don't understand if literally the reason people are going through what they're going through to come here, and there is this vacuum that they're filling, and they're working so hard, and they're being part of our community, and we're looking at sort of that immigrant experience. I mean, a lot of us went through it. You're coming and you're working hard and you're trying to get on your feet, and you're really that, and that's why the statistics show that the immigrant community as a whole commits less crimes than the average sort of American community, and that they are contributing a lot that they're not getting back, because a lot of times they have to contribute without formally being part of the system, so they're not going to get the benefit of the contribution to the Social Security Administration, or be able to do a lot of what the others who are given that lawful pathways. So yes, there was an effort in the past, and it didn't sort of pan out because the business community didn't want it, and there was this sort of recognition that, yeah, it's good for us as a whole to have this workforce, and what ended up happening is it became sort of an exploited workforce, right? And that's what we struggled with the during the Biden administration. Like, how do you provide them protection? Because a lot of them are afraid to come in and report wage theft, report horrendous working conditions, and sort of the hours and things of that sort. So there's paths forward. There's ways that we can strike the right balance. It's just been very, very disappointing to see how the politicization of this area has completely paralyzed the system from being able to solve the modern day issues relating to immigration. We're working with old tools, old legal frameworks, old approaches with the massive issues that we're seeing. Like I said, I think UNHCR talks about literally millions and millions of people who have been displaced and continue to go through mass migration, from traditional persecution to economic persecution to dictatorial regimes to climate impacts of climate change. And we haven't had that conversation about how do you evolve and meet the demands of being part of both a global community and even demands of your own country, of our own country, right?
And I hope we can get there, because I do think the conversation should be about evolution. But unfortunately, it's hard to look at what's happening today and not think we're actually devolving, you know? But, like I always say, I haven't lost hope. If I had lost hope, I would not be here having these conversations. I want to turn for a second to the issue of racial profiling. It's something you and I have worked on, both of us throughout our respective careers. It's been an issue that actually got me started in my career path, working on the issue of racial profiling at Amnesty International, and looked at the profiling that was happening pre 9/11 and post 9/11, how that, that the net widened, and so it's been something we have been, as advocates, fighting against, to pass laws to end racial profiling that are effective, and it's always been considered an ineffective and just discriminatory tool. It's where, for folks who might not know, it's where law enforcement uses your race, nationality, religion, perceived race, nationality, religion, accent, what have you, instead of credible evidence that a crime might have been committed, to target people, right? And in a recent Supreme Court ruling, to the dismay of, those of us who've been working on this issue for a long time, and Noam versus Perdomo, it seems that the Supreme Court basically put their stamp of approval on racial profiling. There's countless, evidence and numbers that shows how racial profiling has never worked to provide greater safety and, catch people who are actually committing crimes and breaking laws. But I want to ask you, was that decision, is it a done deal? Or was it specific to LA for people who are speaking Spanish and present in certain communities and working low-paying jobs? Or are the gates just open for anybody to be profiled now who might look like?
Well, technically speaking, that decision was issued on what's now known as sort of the shadow docket of the Supreme Court. And what that means is that these are on emergency petitions that the government is taking to the Supreme Court, bypassing all the traditional deliberative processes and going straight to the Supreme Court to stop a decision from a lower court that they're not happy with. And in this case, it was a district court decision that was voluminous, really writing down in detail all the factual basis for finding that the government was just flagrantly violating the Fourth Amendment rights of individuals, and that they were just engaged in just this basically arbitrary arrest of people that are based on just these racial profiling. And because of that, they repeatedly in that net would be targeting or would be picking up U.S. citizens or people who had status. And so the court said, I need you to just do what the law allows you to do. I'm not telling you to do anything illegal. And that was the sort of twist, right? Because they were talking from the both sides of their mouth. They're saying, we're not racial profiling. We are doing, we're engaged in, Fourth Amendment individualized determination. So the court said, okay, do that individualized determination. You can't use sort of these what in practice what you're doing is actually what you say you're doing and what you're actually doing is not the same. And when the court issued that injunction, that temporary restraining order, the number of raids and the number of arrests dropped drastically.
So when they said don't do it
like this,
right? Because
don't
it's
do
against
it. Don't
the
racial
Constitution, by the way.
because it's yes, it dropped drastically. Anyway, but to your question, it was a really gut-wrenching piece to read by Justice Kavanaugh, who just completely whitewashed the facts. I mean, the narrative that he presented was something like, well, There's been millions of immigrants coming to this country. And yes, most of them may be doing good, but some of them are not doing good. And a lot of them are coming from Central America and in Los Angeles. So it's only natural to assume and recognize the reality of the situation. So using race and your job, the type of work and sort of location and all of that, that's not racial profiling. That's smart detective work, right?
Can that be broadened to other communities, though?
I think it already is, because what we are now seeing with this massive influx of appropriation for ICE and the way that Trump is conflating law enforcement and immigration enforcement together, they're now becoming one and the same, right? So they're using the civil system. The immigration enforcement is civil. A lot of people don't realize that. A lot of this detention is supposed to be civil. It's not for punishment. You don't get anywhere near the type of due process that you get in criminal. And we can talk about that as well in terms of how the Supreme Court sort of, with a wink and a nod, called this civil rather than criminal when it involved the loss of liberty and loss of property for people who've been here for so long with extended ties to the community. And now we're seeing that conflating. I mean, that's why this whole National Guard thing, that this conversation about crime and sending the National Guard into D.C. and Los Angeles, they're conflating it. Yeah. And so the same tactics under the rubric of immigration enforcement is being extended into the criminal enforcement realm.
What's interesting, and not that facts matter anymore, but there's countless studies that show, for example, multiple areas across the country that show when police, for example, stop using race as an indicator to stop people to search for contraband, their hit rates, the rates at which they actually find contraband and illegal products, go up. And turning to a more personal note, you've also experienced being profiled when you were a judge, of all things, by people from the Obama administration who questioned your ability to be impartial and neutral in your immigration cases that might have involved people who are from Iran because you have Iranian background. How wild. Tell us about that.
Sure. It's even more absurd than that. It all stemmed from an invitation I received to attend a White House roundtable during the Obama administration that was being convened for Iranian American leaders. Mm-hmm. That was the extent of it. I wasn't appearing on behalf of any organization. I wasn't advocating for anything. It was an invitation by the White House.
And you were an appointed judge.
That's right. I was an immigration judge. I was an appointed immigration judge within the Department of Justice of the executive branch, underneath, ultimately, the president. And I got all the clearances. I got all the ethics clearances and all the, you need to be mindful of this and all. I get it, no problem. And nevertheless, I came back and they said, well, there's an appearance of impartiality or impropriety. Just for the sake of appearance, we think you should recuse yourself from all cases of Iranian nationals. And I said, wow. I'm sorry, what? On what basis? I said, well, because you got this invitation to the White House. I said, I didn't get an invitation to the Iranian government. It's not like this has nothing to do, I don't even understand. And they just doubled down. They wouldn't give me anything else. And I said, have you done this to anybody else? No. And ultimately what I found out, and this is the most sort of troubling, and if it wasn't so tragic, it would be funny. The evidence they presented in support of their assertion that there is an appearance, not an actual, impartial bias, but there's an appearance of impropriety or something like that, was that they ran my last name, and the word Iran. So they put Tabaddor in Iran into Google.
Very effective.
And it got 700 hits. Literally, that was the entire rubric of the basis. But what is
the indication of that? So what?
So I said, okay, well, what did the 700 hits say? Well, they didn't even keep, They didn't even keep the results. They didn't even go anything beyond. They said, well, it showed you're connected to Iran. So in their head, Tabaddor and Iran. I said, yes, I'm Iranian American. And then I found out that they had misspelled my last name, even in that Google search, which is a common misspelling. They did it with 2 B's instead of 1 B. So it, to me, again, showed, that laziness, right? And maybe it's a combination of laziness and it's a combination of the human nature, right? And so we all know, if you're Middle Eastern, if you're like Muslim background, if you're the other, that's what you will be defined as. So if there's anything that makes you sort of, from their perspective, part of that, immediately there's a reaction to it. So I had to file a lawsuit. It took several years to go through the administrative process. And we had to go to district court. And of course, they kept sort of doubling down. We went to district court. And literally within the first hearing, the district court judge looked at the government counsel and said, have you ever done this to anybody else? And counsel said, no. And he said, you need to make this case go away. So he assigned it to the magistrate judge. And by the end of it, the government signed a stipulation that said, okay, you didn't do anything wrong. We're going to go back and reinterpret and take a look at the regulation. We're going to give you your attorney's fees. And we're going to give you like a writing that says you didn't do anything wrong. This has nothing to do with you. We're going to go back. But it took years. It took years of litigation. And I was lucky that I was able to find sort of amazing. First, it was an amazing organization, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, that stepped up immediately. And then Ali Mojdahi, who is a very prominent Iranian American attorney, partner in a firm, when he heard about it, he said, we can't let this go. And he stepped up, and I'm forever grateful to him and his team that he brought and so successfully litigated this. And I remember even then thinking, well, where's the Iranian American Legal Defense Fund? We don't have a legal defense fund.
There is one now.
Oh, that was my preview. There is one now. And not too soon. We've been waiting for it for a long time. But yeah, I mean, I think this is going to be a continuous struggle in trying to. I think that's part of that whole human nature, the us versus them, this tribal. I mean, there's just something so instinctive, I think, in us that we're a social group, and by definition of being a social, we're social animals, and by being definition of being social animals, we create our groups. And anytime you sort of create a group, part of the definition of a group is somebody who's not in it. It's easy to then be able to quickly differentiate. Maybe I'll share this one story that for me was an eye-opening experience in how much we work with these, I call these unexamined assumptions. I remember when I moved from Southern California to go to law school in San Francisco. I went to UC Hastings at the time, UC Law, SF now, and moved into sort of right in the heart of Civic Center, which is very close to the Castro district, which is sort of where the gay community lived. And I was young. I mean, it's not that I didn't know about the gay community, but it was new to me. And I came, and those first few months, all I ever saw was just that binary categorization. It was just like everything I did was I defined the other person by the sexual orientation. And it took that experience when I started engaging enough with enough people of the LGBT community to realize that, oh my God, they're not all the same. It sounds really simple, right? But it really took like that time there where I had to get to know the community and see the humanity. Because before they were just, not that I didn't think they were human, but they became part of the community that I saw as part of us. Oh, you could be for this, or you could be a Democrat, you can be a Republican, you can be engaged in this, you may like dancing, you may like what I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but it really was something like that. You started to see them as more than just defined by this one definition. and recognize you can't treat them all in one bucket. And then the final pinnacle was I was more part of the Women's Law Journal, and I was the minority in the sexual orientation. So, I'm the only not the only. I think I was, and that too was a really awakening experience of, wow, it really is a different experience. So I hope that more people go through those kinds of life experiences that tune them into why racial profiling is so wrong, why doing the other categorization is so not just wrong, but short-sighted and ineffective and harmful for a lot of what we're trying to do as members of society.
I mean, human identity and the human experience is so fluid. And the more walls we build and the more categories we create to place people in, unless we're super aware of it,
That's right.
can serve to just divide us.
That's right.
And we all have biases, and we got to check our biases. I think people get offended. Everyone has biases. There's people in power who can act on those biases, which then becomes racism, which is a whole power dynamic if you really want to talk about it, right? But I think we just have a responsibility to break those walls and be in community with people. And we just don't do that enough. And it scares me that the world that we are creating is offering less and less opportunities to be in those spaces where you can have human connection with people who are not like you. So it takes concerted effort for us to move away from where we're headed right now.
I mean, that's why I'm so worried about this absolute war on sort of the DEI principles or the implicit bias training principles, because I think those of us who are advocates of these principles, we're not saying you shouldn't have groups. I'm not, I'm a member of the Iranian American community. I'm also a woman. I'm also part of a number of different organizations and groups and communities and families. Nobody's saying you cannot have a group that you affiliate with or identify with or are proud of. I think all of those are absolutely wonderful, and you should. But we have to recognize that if you don't stop yourself when you are involved with those groups and recognize that you are going to instinctively, with those implicit biases, immediately treat the people on the other side of that group as different, and especially in areas where it matters in areas of housing, in areas of education, in areas of employment, in areas of quote unquote national security or immigration, all of these areas where it can have a profound adverse impact on people if you're coming at it with that closed mind, with the blindness to it. And so, yeah, I'm worried about that. I'm worried about how erasing that in this language of colorblindness and in the language of post-racial society, right? That's the recipe for disaster.
100%. I always tell people who tell me, I don't see race, I don't see color. The only response is, you should go have your eyes checked, because race exists and you got to accept it. Anyway, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but let me ask you this. What keeps you going and what gives you hope in this moment?
I'm lucky that I think my default is generally an optimistic person. I'm also lucky that I'm a very, very sort of purpose-driven person. I believe in so strongly the importance of being a member of our community and helping. When I talk sometimes with my husband, I say, look, I just feel connected. I just feel like we can't live as islands. We're connected to one another, and we have a duty and a responsibility to one another. And so I think that's always been my driving force. I think that's what drew me to public service, drew me to the bench. All of that was just this need to give back. It's a tough time. These are dark times. I won't sugarcoat it. It's been probably one of the most difficult times, seeing the rule of law just in so many ways destroyed, seeing the Department of Justice turn on its head, seeing everything that I'm seeing. But I like to believe that at the end of it, what did they say? The arch of history bends towards justice. And as my friend reminded me, the only way it's going to bend towards justice is if we all stick to it and hang, pull it down, right? And I said, I'm going to be one of those people that's going to throw my weight on that arch and pull it down. And I'd like to believe, and I do believe, that there are enough of us out there that are going to help bend that arch.
And I think in some ways, I say this often, it's good to see what we're faced with versus having them be in the shadows. And so we know how much gravity and pull we got to put on this arch,
Two more things that sort of jumps out at me and that I've learned now is that the other side is human too.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that they're not some superpower, immortal magic. So you're dealing with humans. So they're going to have their strengths and weaknesses. It isn't some sort of extraterrestrial force that you're dealing with. And then second part is that having worked in leadership where you're sort of in those meetings or in those policy discussions and everything like that, where you're trying to set the stage and trying to come up with everything, I learned how much more important the frontline people were. Because it doesn't matter who's on top if the person at the front line, if the person who has to do a lot of the work, or if the person who's actually sort of carrying the water, so to speak, isn't with you, doesn't matter. So every single person is required for this. So every single person can make a difference. Yeah. And so I like to believe that I can make a difference. And that's how I keep hope alive. And I like to think that I can maybe grab a couple of people along the way and make it happen, change that trajectory.
Well, amen to that. I'll join you in that way. My last question, putting aside all the things we've talked about today, what's one conversation that you want to reset? It doesn't have to be related to immigration or politics. It could be something that you think it's just gone off the rails, it's been hijacked or weaponized, or it can even be about pop culture, something that you think is important that we reset.
That's a tough question. There's just so many areas that are right now under attack, and it's hard to sort of categorize it as reset per se. I think of it more as what's the one area that probably needs most attention so that the rest can hopefully fall into place. And I think we talked a little bit about this off camera, which was I feel that we need to go back to basics and just have the conversations about the principles that govern our approach to government. And I think I know this sounds very nerdy, but going back to separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism, and the importance of an educated voting public, the importance of people sort of just understanding the framework. I've just noticed that we have to, like, a lot of the conversations I'm having, unless the person has that foundational understanding, none of this makes sense. None of it. So if I talk about rule of law, they don't understand what it means. If I talk about due process, they don't understand what it means. If I talk about checks, if I talk about any of this, about what's happening with Congress, what's happening with the president, what's going on with the Supreme Court, with voting, with civil rights, any one of these things, unless you have at least a basic framework understanding of what is our government based on and what your role is, none of it makes sense. So I think that's the one area that it's hard to admit. You said we're going to have to go back to having in-person conversations or go back to the library, I feel like we need to go back to 8th grade or to the 10th grade civics class and have those conversations to remind people why this is unacceptable.
So we have our marching orders. I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been really, really fruitful and eye-opening, and I hope people who tune in can really begin to think about some of these issues and kind of put aside everything that they're exposed to and just do some thinking and do some research and figure out, like, in their heart of hearts, with their own human lens, what they believe is right and what they believe about these issues that have just been weaponized, I think, to divide us. And thank you for the work you've done and the way you're helping to reset the conversations with your students.
Thank you for having me. It's been such a delight. I mean, you just have a presence. Thank you for making this opportunity possible. And I firmly believe that, what I think we talked about the Persian saying, قطره قطره جمع شود تا روزی دریا شود. Drop by drop, should it be collected to make a sea and an ocean? And you're definitely leading that. And thank you for including me.
I'm a drop and you're a drop, and we'll collect more, and there are many more. So thank you for joining us today. I hope that you found the conversation helpful and illuminating as I did. You can find Reset Critical on social media and all the platforms where you find your podcasts. Until next time, stay hopeful. Thanks for tuning in to Reset Critical. Remember, the opinions you heard today belong to our guests and don't necessarily reflect the views of the institutions they represent, the host, producers, or our sponsors and affiliates. Mentions of products or organizations aren't endorsements. We're here to spark ideas and dialogue. Until next time, take care and keep thinking critically.